Hey guys, tonight we're diving into the ancient world, back when the Egyptians had to figure out time without the luxury of clocks. Imagine living without a ticking clock or glowing screen to tell you when to wake up, when to eat, or when to sleep. You'd need to get creative, right? Well, the ancient Egyptians did exactly that, and they were good at it. They started by looking straight above at the grand timekeeper, the sun. Now, before you start thinking about a simple sunrise to sunset approach, let's throw in a curveball. The Egyptians didn't just watch the sun move. They used it as a sophisticated celestial guide. You probably won't survive this one unless you're super adaptable, so buckle up. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. And hey, drop your location and local time in the comments below. Let's see where in the world you're listening from. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. It's easy to think of the ancient Egyptians as just people building pyramids or crafting magnificent statues, but their everyday lives were intricately woven with time. For starters, they had no watches or digital clocks, no buzzing reminders to get things done. Instead, they turned to what was right above them, the sun. And the Egyptians, always pragmatic and observant, realized that the sun's path across the sky could give them a solid foundation tool for measuring time. During the day, their primary marker was the sun's position as it ascended in the sky and then descended at dusk. The Egyptians didn't just care about whether it was day or night, but rather the specific angles and stages of sunlight. Their timekeeping system wasn't rigid, like ours, with fixed hours. Instead, they tracked the sun's journey by breaking the day into segments. From sunrise, it would be divided into what they called watches, a system that would later inform other time-measuring devices. So, if you've ever wondered how people without clocks managed, well, the answer is in the sky. The sun itself became a giant, reliable clock if you knew how to read it. Historians still argue about the specific methods the Egyptians used to mark these segments, but most agree on one thing. The sun's predictable path gave them an essential rhythm to their day. But this solar clock wasn't the only game in town, because when the sun disappeared, another system had to take over to guide them through the night. When the sun dipped below the horizon and the cool night took over, how did the ancient Egyptians track time? They didn't have streetlights, smartphones, or any of the other luxuries we rely on to keep us on track. But just like their use of the sun, they had developed a clever solution to measure time in the dark: sundials. But hold on, these weren't the fancy, sleek sundials you might picture today. No, these were practical devices built out of stone or wood, with shadows playing a central role in how time was measured. Imagine yourself standing under the Egyptian sky, feeling the dry desert breeze on your skin. You're holding a rudimentary sundial, trying to gauge time based on how the sun casts its shadow. For the Egyptians, this was their way of splitting the day into meaningful intervals. By creating a simple post in the ground, known as a gnomon, the Egyptians used the shadow it cast at different times of day to mark the hours. It was a system that was effective as long as the sun was out. They divided the daylight into 12 parts. Yes, 12 hours, because 12 was a sacred number to the Egyptians, just like it would become in many other cultures across history. But what about those nights when the moon was hidden or the stars clouded over? Well, that's where their ingenuity really came into play. The Egyptians weren't just concerned with the passage of time during the day. They were trying to measure it across all phases. And this is where we see a quirky twist in their approach. Some ancient Egyptians created portable sundials that could also work in the dark using artificial light. Imagine a tiny flame, or even a glowing ember acting as your sundial's light source. While not widespread, it shows just how adaptable they were in their pursuit of time measurement. Still, historians are divided on how exactly the Egyptians calibrated their sundials, whether they used a fixed system or if it was more of a by-feel kind of deal. But what's certain is that the sundials they crafted were a step forward in helping people of the time keep track of the hours. They weren't just a neat invention. They represented the beginning of a profound understanding of how to divide time into meaningful chunks. And here's the kicker. As the night rolled in and the stars took over the sky, the Egyptians had another ace up their sleeve, a whole new way of marking time, a system more mysterious and celestial than the humble sundial. Ready to see how they made sense of the night sky? As the sun dipped below the horizon and the stars twinkled to life, the ancient Egyptians turned their gaze upward, once again relying on the sky to guide their sense of time. Now, you might think that night, with its quiet and endless darkness, would make time harder to track. But for the Egyptians, the night wasn't just empty space. It was a vast celestial clock that connected them to something much bigger than their immediate surroundings. The key to this nighttime timekeeping: the stars. But not just any stars. The Egyptians paid close attention to certain constellations that appeared in the sky at specific times of the year. Imagine yourself standing in the Egyptian desert, feeling the cool night air swirl around you. The stars above aren't just pretty. They're the ticking hands of a cosmic timepiece. The Egyptians looked up and relied on the predictable patterns of these celestial bodies to mark time throughout the night. The appearance of certain stars, like the bright and radiant Sirius, was a signal that certain events were on the horizon. It's no coincidence that the rising of Sirius, known as the Dog Star, marked the beginning of the annual flooding of the Nile, an event that was crucial to the Egyptian agricultural cycle. Historians still argue about how precisely the Egyptians calibrated their star-based timekeeping system, but it's widely agreed that they were able to track the rise and fall of key stars. One method they likely used involved aligning certain stars with fixed structures on the ground. These structures could be temples or obelisks, which acted as markers or guides, helping them measure how much time had passed during the night. Every year, the same stars would rise at the same time, giving the Egyptians a reliable way to track longer periods beyond just the day or night. Now, here's a quirky tidbit. Not only did they use stars to mark time, but they also tied this celestial clock to their mythology. The rising of stars like Sirius didn't just signal time passing, they were also tied to gods and important mythological figures. For example, the goddess Isis was associated with Sirius, and her annual return was connected to the fertility and prosperity that came with the Nile's flooding. So, while we might think of time as a purely mechanical concept today, the ancient Egyptians saw time through the lens of divinity and cosmic order. Some historians even suggest that the Egyptians believed the stars were the eyes of the gods watching over them, keeping track of every hour. There's still some debate about the exact role of religious symbolism in their timekeeping, but what's clear is that the Egyptians saw their connection to the stars as not just functional, but also spiritual. It wasn't simply about knowing when it was time to harvest or build. It was about understanding the rhythms of the universe and aligning their lives with those divine cycles. Now, with these celestial clocks in mind, let's talk about how the Egyptians also took care of timekeeping during those periods when the night sky wasn't available, like during cloudy nights or when a full moon made the stars less visible. How did they fill in the gaps when their heavenly timepiece was obscured? When the stars weren't visible, whether due to cloudy skies or the moon's overpowering light, the ancient Egyptians had to find alternative ways to measure time. And, as always, they didn't simply sit back and give up. No, they had a clever, albeit sometimes watery, solution: the water clock. Imagine this. Instead of waiting for a shadow to fall across a sundial or a star to rise in the sky, you could measure time with the steady drip of water. It's a bit like watching the second hand on a clock, but in this case, the second hand is a continuous stream of water. Water clocks, or clepsydra as they were known, were a remarkable step in timekeeping. They worked by allowing water to flow from one container to another at a constant rate. As the water filled the second container, it would mark the passage of time. For the Egyptians, this method was especially useful during the night when the sky was obscured, or when they needed a more accurate, continuous measure of time for rituals, court functions, or even the work of priests. Picture a priest performing a ritual. The steady drip of water in the background, keeping track of the hours until the sacred task was complete. Historians still debate the exact design of these early water clocks. Did they use a simple container and a slow leak? Or were they more sophisticated, with a mechanism that could control the flow more precisely? Either way, the principle remained the same: steady water flow, steady timekeeping. The Egyptians likely made these out of stone, which would ensure the materials held up over time. And while not as precise as modern clocks, these water clocks were far more accurate than anything that had come before. There's also a quirky aspect to the use of water clocks. The Egyptians didn't just use them to measure time in the mundane sense, like, it's time for dinner. These clocks had a sacred ceremonial quality. The gradual, rhythmic nature of the water drip had an almost meditative feel. In fact, the water clock's steady dripping became a way of marking time during religious ceremonies. Time, in this context, wasn't something you just counted off. It was something you felt, something you lived. The continuous flow of water was as much about connecting to the gods as it was about measuring seconds. Now, you might be wondering, if these clocks were useful in ceremonies, how did they measure the hours of the day? Well, the Egyptians had figured that out too. They didn't use water clocks during the daytime because, remember, they had the sun for that. But when the night came and they couldn't rely on stars or the moon, these clever water clocks kept the time flowing smoothly. What's really fascinating is how the Egyptians combined their day and night timekeeping methods. The sun was their guide during daylight, and the water clock took over at night. But their entire system of timekeeping was still based on a larger, almost metaphysical sense of cosmic order. This wasn't just about practical time. It was about syncing their daily life with the rhythms of the universe. Still, not everyone used the water clock the same way. Larger temples and royal palaces often had the most advanced versions, while everyday Egyptians might have relied on simpler methods. How did the elite use these timekeeping systems? Was there a sense of sacredness to the time they tracked, especially when it came to religious and state rituals? Let's dive into how timekeeping became central to Egypt's temples and the royal courts. As you might imagine, the everyday Egyptian wasn't the only one interested in marking time. The temples and royal courts of ancient Egypt were places where timekeeping took on a level of precision and ceremony that far exceeded the typical daily needs. Time wasn't just a practical tool for the people, especially in these sacred spaces. It became something divine, tied deeply to the gods, their rituals, and the very fabric of Egyptian life. For the priests and royalty, time wasn't a vague concept. It was as structured as their beliefs, with its own rhythm and purpose. Now, picture yourself entering one of these grand temples, surrounded by towering stone columns and the faint scent of incense in the air. Inside, priests are moving about, but everything is in perfect order. The rituals are precise, scheduled, and sacred, and the very passage of time plays a pivotal role. In these spaces, the Egyptians didn't just track time casually. They measured it for a much deeper purpose, to honor their gods and maintain the harmony of the universe. Timekeeping was essential for the performance of religious rituals, and each hour had a specific significance. To keep everything in line, temples used an advanced form of timekeeping, whether it was large water clocks or complex sundials, designed to mark the hours with extreme accuracy. The priests often had to track time during ceremonies that could span many hours or even days, and they needed to ensure that the rituals followed the proper cosmic order. The connection between time and divinity was so profound that these ceremonies were often timed according to celestial events, like the rising of specific stars or the movements of the moon. In the royal courts, time also took on an air of importance. Pharaohs, who were seen as living gods, needed to know exactly when to make crucial decisions, conduct military campaigns, or hold feasts to honor the gods. For them, time was not only a practical tool, it was part of their divine right. Their power was often framed within the precision of celestial cycles. For example, the precise flooding of the Nile River, which the Egyptians depended on for crops, was deeply tied to their ability to measure time with the rise of the star Sirius. When the star appeared, the pharaoh knew it was time to prepare for the annual flooding, an event that would ensure Egypt's prosperity. Historians still argue about whether the timekeeping methods of the royal courts and temples were as accurate as we believe. It's hard to imagine how a water clock, no matter how refined, could keep track of time precisely enough for such important matters. But what's undeniable is that timekeeping in these spaces was ceremonial, sacred, and connected to the cosmos in ways that modern systems of measurement could never replicate. Time wasn't a commodity, it was a spiritual force. Interestingly, some believe the Egyptians' connection to time and the heavens was so profound that they even created timekeeping systems specifically to honor the gods. The hours of the day were often divided into sets of watches that aligned with the pantheon of gods they worshipped. Each watch represented a specific god's influence on the world. Priests might time a ritual to coincide with the hour dedicated to Ra, the sun god, or to honor Osiris, the god of the afterlife, in the evening. But it wasn't just the temples and royal courts that had a vested interest in time. Regular Egyptians also experienced the effects of this divine system of timekeeping. Although they might not have had the grand water clocks or stargazing rituals of the elite, they still understood the importance of rhythm in their daily lives. Timekeeping, from the perspective of an everyday Egyptian, was about aligning yourself with the world's natural rhythms, whether it was the time for work, rest, or religious observance. So, as we take a deeper look at the way the Egyptians connected time with the divine, we see how their worldview affected their understanding of time, an understanding that stretched far beyond what we think of as the mundane tick-tock of the clock. Time wasn't something to be measured. It was something to be respected and understood in connection to the gods and the natural world. With this connection to the divine in mind, it's clear that the Egyptian concept of time was much more than a simple measurement. But how did all of this tie into their calendar system? How did the Egyptians translate their observations of time into a structured system of months, days, and years? Let's look at how they designed a calendar that would forever shape how civilizations track the passage of time. As the sun rose again each day and set each night, the ancient Egyptians needed a way to track the passing of time that wasn't just based on the immediate moment. They had already established a system for the hours of the day and night, tied to the sun, the stars, and celestial events. But to manage agricultural cycles, festivals, and religious observances, they needed something more, something that could mark the passage of entire years, months, and days. This is where the Egyptian calendar comes in, and it's one of the most significant contributions to timekeeping that the world would see for centuries. Imagine yourself in an ancient Egyptian village, looking out across the vast, fertile Nile River. Time doesn't just pass here in an abstract sense. It's tied directly to the rhythm of the river. The Egyptians were profoundly connected to the annual flooding of the Nile, a natural event that renewed the soil and allowed for successful agriculture. This flooding, which was crucial for life in Egypt, happened almost precisely at the same time every year. For the Egyptians to plan for this and make sure they had enough time to prepare, they needed a way to measure the years. And so, they created a calendar system. The Egyptian calendar was based on the solar year, with 365 days, 12 months of 30 days each, plus an additional 5 days at the end of the year to make up the difference. The months were divided into 3 10-day weeks, making each month fairly predictable. And while it might sound strange to us, given that we divide our months into varying lengths, this 30-day month structure was consistent and worked for the Egyptians, especially when it came to agriculture. Historians still argue about how exactly the Egyptians first came up with the idea of dividing the year into 12 months, but most agree that it was linked to their observations of the sky. The Egyptians had already been tracking the cycles of the moon and stars, and these celestial patterns influenced their understanding of the year. They didn't have the precise leap year system we use today to account for the extra 0.25 days each year. So their calendar didn't line up perfectly with the solar year, but it was still incredibly accurate for its time. The 5 extra days at the end of the year were especially interesting. These days were not considered part of any month and were seen as a time for festivals and holidays, a break from the usual rhythm. These days were often dedicated to the gods, adding an extra layer of sacredness to the calendar. So, while the calendar helped track the passage of time, it also played a role in maintaining the connection between the people and their deities. What's particularly fascinating is that the Egyptian calendar laid the foundation for later timekeeping systems. The ancient Greeks and Romans, as well as later civilizations, would borrow elements from this structure. In fact, many of the elements that we take for granted in our own calendar, like the idea of a 365-day year, have their roots in Egypt. And yet, despite its usefulness, the Egyptian calendar wasn't entirely perfect, since the Egyptians didn't have the technology to track the fraction of a day that was lost each year. They didn't account for the shift in the calendar year that happens every 4 years, which we now call a leap year. As a result, their calendar slowly drifted out of sync with the seasons, which could be problematic for agricultural planning. Still, it was a remarkable achievement and a step toward creating a standardized way of understanding time that would influence the ancient world and beyond. The Egyptians didn't just stop with the calendar. They also found ways to integrate their calendar system into their broader worldview, tying their months and years to religious events, floods, and harvests. This makes sense, given that their very lives were structured around the river's flooding cycle. The calendar wasn't just a tool for managing time. It was a way of making sense of the world itself. But the Egyptians weren't the only ones who were tracking time on a larger scale. As their empire grew and their influence spread, other cultures began to adopt and adapt the Egyptian system of timekeeping, setting the stage for the evolution of more complex calendars across the world. And with their system of time tracking in place, the Egyptians turned their attention to even more precise methods of marking time, methods that would, in time, lead to the more sophisticated timekeeping we use today. So, how did these innovations influence timekeeping beyond Egypt? Well, that's where we're headed next, to see how Egyptian methods impacted time for centuries. With their timekeeping methods firmly in place, the ancient Egyptians laid down the foundations for a system of understanding time that would influence cultures far beyond their borders. As Egypt's power and influence spread through the ancient world, so did their innovations in tracking time. But the temples, priests, and pharaohs weren't the only ones keeping an eye on the hours. Eventually, time would need to be measured with greater precision to manage larger societies and their growing needs. In the royal courts and temples, the connection between time and the divine was paramount. For the Egyptian elite, time wasn't merely a practical tool for scheduling. It was a direct link to the cosmic order. Every event, from the rise of the sun to the flooding of the Nile, was seen through the lens of the divine. But while their calendar helped them track years and the stars marked their days and nights, the Egyptians were also the first to experiment with more precise tools, setting the stage for innovations in timekeeping that would ripple through history. The introduction of the water clock, or clepsydra, was a key step toward these advancements. We've already talked about how water clocks helped the Egyptians measure time in the absence of sunlight or stars. But as the technology spread, it evolved beyond the simple containers that dripped water to more sophisticated mechanisms that allowed the tracking of smaller increments of time. While these devices weren't perfect, they were a step toward the mechanical clocks that would come later. Some believe that the Egyptians even used clepsydras for ceremonial purposes, especially in their temples, where the steady drip of water was seen as a divine rhythm, echoing the flow of life itself. Then came the sundials, which had already been part of Egyptian life for centuries. The Egyptians had a deep understanding of the sun's path across the sky and used this knowledge to create sundials that could mark the passage of time with remarkable accuracy. But it wasn't just about the passing hours. Sundials were also tools for understanding the cycles of the cosmos. By aligning these sundials with the positions of the stars, Egyptians could predict important events in both earthly and cosmic terms. Interestingly, the Egyptians were not the only ancient civilization to invent timekeeping tools, but they were one of the first to tie those tools directly to both their understanding of the cosmos and their religious practices. This blending of practical need with spiritual belief was something uniquely Egyptian. The use of time in their temples, for instance, wasn't just about telling when the priests needed to perform their rituals. It was about marking the cosmic cycles that connected the heavens to the earth and, ultimately, to the will of the gods. As Egyptian influence spread across the ancient Mediterranean, neighboring civilizations began to adopt similar timekeeping methods. The Greeks, inspired by Egyptian astronomy, further refined the use of sundials and water clocks, adapting them to their own cultural contexts. Even the Romans took cues from Egyptian timekeeping, developing their own calendar systems and mechanical clocks. While their versions were more refined, they still echoed the Egyptian legacy in their structure and purpose. And yet, the legacy of Egyptian timekeeping didn't stop at the borders of the ancient world. When we think of timekeeping today, the systems we rely on, from mechanical clocks to the digital ones in our pockets, owe something to the Egyptians. They were the first to define the day, the year, and the celestial rhythms that we still measure today. Their understanding of time was not just about practicality. It was a worldview that intertwined the divine with the daily. Even in their afterlife beliefs, time was important. The Egyptians believed that when a soul moved on to the afterlife, it would be judged by the gods. The soul would face the weighing of the heart ceremony, where its deeds would be measured against the feather of Ma'at, the goddess of truth and order. This cosmic moment was a symbolic marking of time, showing that the passage of time, even beyond death, was an eternal cycle that would be evaluated for its balance and harmony. The Egyptians' approach to time, blending the celestial with the terrestrial, was their way of making sense of the world around them. But as their innovations began to filter into other cultures, the concept of time itself would continue to evolve. The steady march of Egyptian timekeeping methods would set the stage for the sophisticated systems that we now take for granted. Yet, there's a certain peaceful beauty in remembering how, long ago, people stood beneath the same sky we do, measuring time with the same sun, stars, and water, forever intertwined with the cosmic forces they revered. So how did all these innovations, from the sundials to the calendars, shape the way we think about time today? The ripple effect from ancient Egypt reaches us through centuries, through innovations passed on by generations of civilizations. Let's take a final look at how Egyptian timekeeping influences us in the modern world. As the centuries passed and civilizations rose and fell, the ancient Egyptians' methods of timekeeping left a lasting imprint on the world. Their tools, calendars, and celestial observations became the foundation upon which later cultures built more refined systems of time management. It's fascinating to think that the way we manage time today, down to the precise seconds of each minute, owes a great deal to the methods the Egyptians perfected thousands of years ago. In ancient Egypt, the use of time wasn't just a means to get through the day. It was about creating a connection between the human experience and the divine. The sun's journey across the sky, the stars marking the night, and the rhythmic flow of the Nile. All of these were not just the passing of time, but a way to synchronize human life with the eternal rhythms of the universe. This divine approach to time had a profound impact, influencing not just Egypt, but the broader ancient world. As Egyptian timekeeping spread through other cultures, the methods evolved. The Greeks, inspired by Egyptian astronomical knowledge, were the first to introduce mechanical clocks that could measure smaller intervals of time. The Romans further refined these ideas, developing devices that could track time with greater precision and even introducing the concept of dividing the day into fixed hours, a structure that we still use today. But perhaps the most lasting legacy of Egyptian timekeeping is the 24-hour day. The Egyptians were among the first to divide the day into two halves, day and night, and then subdivide each half into 12 hours, creating a system that would be passed down through the Greeks, Romans, and eventually to the modern world. This 24-hour cycle is so ingrained in our daily lives that it's hard to imagine a time before it existed. But it all began with the Egyptians' need to make sense of the natural world, to divide their time between labor, rest, and religious observance. The Egyptian calendar, too, would go on to influence later civilizations. The Greeks, for example, borrowed heavily from the Egyptian solar calendar when creating their own. The Romans adopted similar structures, and eventually the Western world settled on a calendar system that, while adjusted to account for the leap year, still follows the Egyptian pattern of 12 months with a set number of days. The Egyptians also invented the concept of the week, which has become a global standard. Their division of the month into 3 10-day weeks was adopted by other ancient societies, eventually evolving into the 7-day week we use today. This change, though seemingly minor, had a profound effect on the way people viewed time, creating a system of weeks, months, and years that organized the flow of daily life in ways the Egyptians could never have fully imagined. Of course, we can't forget the crucial role that the Egyptians played in shaping the early concept of hours. While their hours were based on the position of the sun and the stars, they eventually adopted a system of 12 hours each for day and night. This was a groundbreaking move that would influence the development of mechanical clocks much later. Over time, more advanced civilizations would begin to break the hour into minutes and seconds. But it all traces back to that ancient Egyptian understanding of time cycles. Even today, when we glance at our watches or glance at the ticking clock on the wall, we are connected to a system that's been refined for thousands of years. We measure time by the same celestial rhythms that the Egyptians did, albeit with more sophisticated tools. But their approach to timekeeping, combining the celestial with the terrestrial, still lingers in our modern consciousness. So, when you look at the clock, or when you check the calendar to see when the next big event is, take a moment to remember the ancient Egyptians. Their legacy of timekeeping has not only influenced the way we structure our days, but also how we relate to the passage of time itself. From the movement of the sun to the rhythm of the stars, the Egyptians gave us a framework that is as timeless as the universe they sought to understand. Now, before we finish up this journey, let's slow things down. Cool things down. With everything we've explored, the ingenuity of the sundial, the mystery of the water clock, and the celestial navigation of the stars, one thing becomes clear. The Egyptians had an unshakable understanding of the rhythms that govern time. They may have lacked the technology we have today, but their connection to time was in many ways far deeper than the simple act of counting seconds. They lived their lives in harmony with the cosmic dance, and in that dance, time wasn't just measured, it was felt, experienced, and revered. And as we close this chapter on the Egyptians' mastery of time, remember this: you might be checking your phone for the time, but the same celestial forces that guided the Egyptians' days are still above you. The sun rises and sets, the stars move across the sky, and time continues to flow in its eternal rhythm. In the end, whether we're tracking the hour with a sundial or a digital watch, we're all still part of the same cosmic clock that the Egyptians once followed so closely. Now that we've traced the journey of timekeeping from the Egyptians to the rest of the ancient world, it's fascinating to think about how their methods evolved and influenced the future. Over time, ancient Egyptian timekeeping practices weren't just absorbed into other cultures, they were transformed and refined. As societies grew, so did the need for more precise ways to measure the hours, not just in the sacred halls of temples, but for everyday life as well. By the time the Greek and Roman empires rose to power, they had adopted many elements of Egyptian timekeeping, and they would go on to build the first mechanical clocks and timekeeping devices that closely resemble the ones we use today. The first major leap came with the Greek philosophers and scientists. They looked at the Egyptians' star-based timekeeping methods and refined them with mathematical precision. Think of it this way: the Egyptians had already divided the day into two segments, 12 hours for day and 12 for night. But they were using natural markers like the sun and stars to keep track of time. The Greeks, however, began to use more structured mechanical methods. The word hour, which we still use today, comes from the Greek word hora, which originally referred to a division of the day, and the Greeks also further systematized the idea of dividing time into smaller increments, minutes and seconds. Historians still debate whether the Greeks truly revolutionized Egyptian timekeeping, or whether they simply inherited the ideas of earlier civilizations, refining them along the way. But one thing is certain: the Greeks began building timepieces that could measure time with more consistency than anything the Egyptians had been able to manage. Their advancements, especially in mechanical engineering, laid the groundwork for what would eventually become clocks that could measure time without depending on the sun, moon, or water flow. The Romans took these ideas and further developed them. Roman engineers were particularly adept at refining Egyptian innovations, making timekeeping tools that were more practical for both everyday people and for the empire's administrators. The Romans introduced the concept of dividing the day into 24 hours with mechanical clocks, making the passage of time something that could be managed on a much larger scale. Unlike the Egyptians, who measured time primarily with natural phenomena, the Romans wanted time to be something that could be regulated precisely, even in the bustling heart of the empire. And yet, as time passed, many of the celestial rhythms and religious practices that tied the Egyptians' understanding of time began to fade in the Western world. The mechanization of time became increasingly disconnected from the spiritual, cosmic understanding the Egyptians had embraced. Time, for many people, shifted from being a reflection of divine order to simply a tool for everyday management. Even so, echoes of the ancient Egyptians' understanding of time still persist today. When we divide the day into 24 hours, and when we measure time in relation to the sun and the stars, we're still following a pattern first set down by those early Egyptians. And let's not forget the 365-day year. The Egyptians were the ones who created a solar calendar, and that structure is still the backbone of our own Gregorian calendar, used by nearly the entire world. When it comes to how we keep time today, everything is based on the desire to bring more precision to our days. But there's something strangely comforting in the way ancient Egyptians measured time, using shadows, water, and the stars to understand a world that, in many ways, was more unpredictable than ours. The Egyptians weren't just measuring time for the sake of precision. They were connecting with the cosmos in a profound way, trying to understand their place in the universe. Time in the modern world is driven by clocks that tick relentlessly on, marking seconds, minutes, and hours. We often measure it with the expectation that it's a resource to be used, to be managed. But in the ancient Egyptian world, time was something sacred, something woven into the very fabric of the natural world and the divine. As we continue forward in our own busy, clock-driven lives, it might be worth remembering how the Egyptians, with nothing more than their eyes and their ingenuity, figured out how to make sense of the endless passage of time. When you glance at your watch or check the time on your phone, remember that the rhythm you follow is an ancient one. The sun still rises and sets in the same pattern it did over 5,000 years ago. The stars still twinkle across the night sky, and the Nile River still flows through Egypt, carrying with it the legacy of timekeeping that began long before our digital clocks. Now, with all this history in mind, it's almost poetic to think of how connected we still are to the rhythms of time set by the Egyptians. From their sundials and water clocks to their calendars and celestial guidance, they laid the groundwork for a system that has persisted through millennia, bringing the whole world into alignment with the cycles of nature. And though time now appears to be a mechanical concept, counted off in digital seconds, it began with a profound connection to the heavens, to the land, and to the eternal forces of nature that the Egyptians knew so well. As we approach the final stretch of this journey through time, it's a good moment to reflect on how far we've come and how much we still owe to the ancient Egyptians. Their approach to timekeeping, driven by an understanding that was part science, part spirituality, set the stage for everything that followed. The tools they developed, the sundials, water clocks, and the celestial observations, served not just practical purposes, but deep philosophical ones, connecting them with the gods and the rhythms of the universe. While we no longer use water clocks or measure time by the stars, their legacy lives on in the very structure of the hours and days that govern our lives. In today's world, timekeeping has become almost mundane. We rely on atomic clocks, our phones, and digital devices that can measure time with incredible precision down to the millisecond. We've reached a point where we can even manipulate time through technology, speeding it up or slowing it down. Using artificial intelligence or advanced algorithms to calculate the most efficient ways to use our time. But no matter how much technology advances, there's something fundamentally human about our need to track time. It's not just about knowing when to wake up or when to meet someone. It's about understanding our place in the vast, ongoing flow of existence. In the grand scheme of things, time is one of our few constants. It moves relentlessly forward. The ancient Egyptians knew that, of course, but they also understood that time wasn't just a linear progression. It was cyclical, connected to the rise and fall of the Nile, the movement of the sun and stars, and the cycles of nature. Their innovations in timekeeping allowed them to make sense of the world and live in harmony with the cosmic forces around them. Perhaps the most striking thing about their approach was how integrated time was into their daily lives. The Egyptians didn't just measure time, they lived it. Time wasn't something separate from their existence. It was woven into the fabric of their culture, their religion, and their understanding of the universe. For them, the rising of the sun wasn't just the start of a new day. It was a sign of Ra's eternal power, a reminder of the divine order that governed the world. This is where the modern world diverges. We now see time as a resource, something to be managed, spent, or wasted. Our clocks tick on relentlessly, each second marked off as another moment in our busy lives. But there's a certain beauty in how the Egyptians approached time, not just as a way to measure hours, but as a way to connect with something greater than themselves. And that's something we've lost in our pursuit of precision. Perhaps in the rush of our modern lives, we could take a cue from the ancient Egyptians. We could learn to view time not just as a tool for efficiency, but as a way to connect with the world around us. To step back and look at the stars, or feel the rhythms of the earth beneath our feet. And remember that time is not just a series of minutes ticking by, but a part of something far larger and more profound. So, as we wrap up tonight's journey, take a moment to think about your relationship with time. How often do you pause and consider the great sweep of history, the thousands of years that have shaped the way you live today? The Egyptians didn't just create clocks, they created a connection between their lives and the universe. And while we may not use their tools or follow their methods today, we're still walking the same path they set in motion all those years ago. Now take a deep breath. Let the weight of the day slip away. And remember that the ancient Egyptians measured time not just to know when things happened, but to understand the deeper rhythm of life itself. The stars are still out there. The sun will still rise tomorrow, and time continues to move forward, just as it always has. Now, dim the lights, relax, and let the eternal flow of time lull you into a peaceful slumber. The Egyptians may have measured it with their sundials and water clocks, but well, you can simply let it be, knowing that time will always be there, just as it was for them.